Okay, so welcome back to the next session titled Decolonizing Futures. We'll be starting with Babatunde Ogundiwin with his research community-owned farm settlement schemes, exploring an agrarian spatial thought.
Okay, thank you. Nice talking to you all. My name is Babatunde Ntuli. I'm an awaited examiner student. The topic of my presentation is Community-Owned Farm Settlement Scheme, exploring an agrarian spatial thought. Sorry, is the slide I uploaded, is it showing? Excuse me, please. Thank you. So the topic of my presentation, as I said earlier, was the Community-Owned Farm Settlement Scheme, exploring an agrarian spatial thought. This presentation is based on one of the case studies in my thesis, which examines the interconnection between cartography, the post-colonial state, and the agricultural settlement scheme. This particular presentation is also based on a paper I'm working upon to publish. So the paper aims to explore the articulation of alternative imagination of the farm settlement scheme as a community-owned initiative. I argue in this paper that aspirations and imaginations expressed in citizen-based maps provide visual insight into agrarian spatial thought. The conceptual focus in this paper is the notion of spatiality, which refers to social practices and representations of social actors in the constitution of spaces in the constitution of in the conduct of everyday life. So I'm engaging a conceptual approach using Lafayette's notion of space that argues that space is a social product. I'm also engaging David Harvey's argument that capitalist rationality plays an important role in the production of space, particularly in post-colonial states. And also, I'm engaging Doreen Massey's work, who argues that space should be seen as a social relation stretched out. So basically, the conceptual focus is interested in how visual representation play an important role in our thinking of alternative futures. So the context to the paper, and in recent times, state-sanctioned neoliberal economic practices are emphasizing the farm block or farm estate as inevitable paths to agricultural prosperity. In contrast, bottom-up initiatives are adapting previous modernist spatial organization as imaginative framework for collective agricultural development. This situation draws attention to the social context of agrarian spatialities on the post-colonial economic landscape. For example, the contrast between traditional farm village and the state-owned settlement scheme. So the traditional farm village is a principal agrarian spatiality where the pattern of inner and outer farming are practiced, for instance, in West Africa. The farm village, in the context of Yorubas in West Africa, refers to a farming workspace related to its immediate urban setting, but remains an outlying production space. The geographical space of the traditional farm village comprised two spatial configurations, the village layout and the actual farm layout. The agronomic practices employed in the modification of the biophysical landscape include field practices such as rotational bush fallow, environmental care such as the use of natural fertilizers, and weather-oriented farm activities, which prevent unnecessary exploitation of the natural environment. For example, certain crops were meant to be harvested during the dry season or the wet season. From these agronomic practices emerged some normative social institutions, such as reciprocal labor, urban-rural migration, whereby the rural workspace was not denigrated because the farmers were also urbanites, and as well as rest house services provided by the farm village. The farm village was not seen just as an economic space, but also as a socio-cultural space. So the focus of the traditional farm village was human well-being rather than economic productivity. Since subaltern groups in Africa were not concerned with economic production guided by quantitative targets, colonial and later post-colonial state discourses identified the traditional farming system as ineffective. The state mainly presented scientific methods of agriculture to serve capitalist rationality of economic growth. So there was introduction of plantation-type agriculture in Africa. One of these modernist type is the farm settlement scheme. The farm settlement scheme is a compact farming space equipped with social amenities and worked by modern technologies to achieve maximum economic production and high standards of living for farmers. The geographical space of the farm settlement scheme comprises zones subdivided into blocks, farm holdings, and plots, as shown in the screen. There's an example of the Ilora farm settlement established in 1960. The farm settlement scheme in southwest Nigeria began in the late colonial period. It was rapidly expanded in the early post-colonial period, but by the 1980s, the scheme had failed to achieve its purpose and became abandoned or underutilized in the 1990s and the early 2000s. In post-neoliberal period, there is a revival of this form of agricultural modernity, evident in the farm blocks or farm estates. A farm block, according to the African Development Bank, is a large agricultural area where backbone infrastructure are provided by government to stimulate sustainable partnerships with private sector investors in conducting agricultural, agribusiness, and economic activities. Unlike the farm settlement scheme, solely operated by state capitalism, the farm block in recent time is operated by partnerships and the organized private sector. This plantation type agriculture is based on the notion of the rational economic man. The concept of rational economic man assumes that the actions or behaviors of rational economic men were based on self-interest to maximize their desire. So this rational self-interest is the backbone of the accumulation of capital that drives the states to establish farm settlements. Hence, the focus of the farm settlement and the recent farm block is about economic production or growth. However, there have always been a reinterpretation of this form of agricultural modernity in the cultural encounter with African aspirations for social change. There were alternative logics of the farm settlement in the late colonial period. For example, in 1948, Nathaniel Onyonide, in an outlined agricultural imaginary sent to the colonial government, described it as its alternative to the plantation system. A year later, the Ojibwe Native Authority Council required the assistance of the colonial government to establish a youth community farm settlement. The letter is right on the screen that was sent to the district officer requesting for assistance to create that farm settlement. So likewise, there is also, in 1957, an Ibadan-based sociocultural organization sought to create a form of non-capitalist agricultural settlement. I believe that these alternatives were overshadowed by the state's scheme between the 1960s and the 1990s. But then economic stagnation has led to rethinking of agricultural development in the rural areas. So in the post-neoliberal period, alternative to state-sanctioned neoliberal agricultural imaginary are emerging. For example, in 2017, the Araromi Community Farm Settlement a community-based initiative, was introduced by the Agrarian Community Development Association. Another example is in 2019, the Ogundiwin Youth Association also introduced enclave-type farming in the Upper Ogun area of Oyo State. A common feature of these community-based organizations is the use of the ideas of the traditional farm village to rethink or reframe modernist farming schemes, resulting in an hybridized form of localized small-scale farming without the capitalist orientation of rational self-interest and large-scale organization. However, these self-defined agricultural imaginaries, though thought-provoking, the specialities of these agrarian futures remain vague. So the focus of my paper is trying to see how we can visualize this agrarian thinking. So I engaged similar interpretations of these modernist agricultural schemes in northeastern Ibadan, hinterland, in Oyo State, southwest Nigeria. I explored the imaginaries of community-based organizations in Lalupan, Erumu, and Ejioku. I'll just focus on the town of Ejioku, the agricultural imaginary of the Ejioku Youth Development Association. Ejioku is a small town, 30 kilometers northeast of Ibadan City in Oyo State. The verbalization of the Ejioku Youth Development Association's imaginary of the youth community farm settlement involved themes such as the size of the farm scheme, land allotment, storage, residence, number of settlers, and the farming system or farming practice. Like other community-based organizations, these verbalized imaginary revealed the reinterpretation of agricultural modernity through the lens of small-scale traditional farm village practice. However, the visualization of this agricultural imaginary in the 3 drawing exercises I facilitated in the town and a nearby village drew further insight into these localized agrarian thoughts. For the purpose of time, because of time, I'll just take 2 examples. On the map, as you can see on the screen, one of the maps that was generated during the participatory drawing exercises, there were several storehouses depicted on the map, highlighting the participants' concern with preventing wastage. So you can, on the screen, you can see several boxes that were depicted as store. And the concern of the participants of the subaltern was how to prevent wastage. It was a very critical thing, and that dictated the way the reason how to make use of space in this encounter of trying to rethink the farm settlement. Another example is the inclusion of a stream on the map that emphasized the importance of fishing. At the top of the map on the screen is the blue-colored lines, which represents the stream, and this is important because it emphasizes the importance of integrating available local resources into the settlement scheme rather than just facing well-defined state systems. So, another important significance of this stream is that in local areas, there's a disapproval of poultry production because of increasing environmental pollution in the rural hinterlands. Air pollution is a serious concern in rural areas and has led to serious legal conflict between poultry producers and rural-based organizations. So visualizing the stores and highlighting fish farming draw attention to the concern of subalterns to not only agricultural production, but also environmental health care. In conclusion, I'll say that the notion of Agbekodako as used in the Yoruba language was how the traditional agrarianism interpreted scientific-oriented capitalist agriculture exemplified in the land settlement scheme. So the notion tries to redefine the meaning of settlement scheme. Previously, listening to introducing the word settlement scheme simply means a government undertaking. But in recent times, this paradigm shift is trying to draw attention to how the people can own their lives afresh with ideas that had predated the colonial or capitalist experience. So the conceptualization of the community farm settlement as a smallholder agriculture is not only about individual sustenance through collective efforts of, but also about environmental care and social practices that focus on the improvement of human well-being. This notion of the community farm settlement offers local communities awareness of an alternative spatial knowledge for localized small-scale farming rather than placing expectations on the valorized state-sanctioned farm blocks. The farm blocks have replaced, the thinking of farm block has replaced the farm settlement scheme, and apparently the cycle of devalorization and valorization continues. But once the communities can take control of their agrarian thinking, I think they can avoid that. So this work, this paper tries to visually reinforce the epistemology of conceptualizing agrarian space for alternative futures. Finally, I want to emphasize that visual spatial representations, such as maps, should be considered a key methodological tool in the practices of decolonizing agrarian futures. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see Charles here, so yeah. Okay. So, Gwinyai, would you like to go, or do you need a minute to prepare? Okay. So then we'll jump straight to Gwinyai Taruvinga on water governance and the colonial legacy in Zimbabwe. Let me just
So thank you very much. I'm happy to see familiar faces and some new faces as well. And I think I have one of the honors of being the very first EFS PhD graduate. So I think I can abuse that privilege for a bit. That's why I came late today, because I was speaking somewhere else. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity. So my topic was water governance and the colonial legacy in Zimbabwe. Um, my actual thesis basically focused on the laws that the post-colonial government inherited in Zimbabwe. So I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of the actual paper and some of the things I sort of tried to unpack. So to start off, I used a theory that is called path dependence. Path dependence basically alludes to the fact that history matters in terms of understanding our post-colonial states. So one of the key authors of path dependence is a gentleman by the name Mahoney. And in relation to the paper that I wrote, the argument I was making was that path dependence is linked to the types of institutions and also the types of laws that a country has. And after the attainment of independence, we find that many post-colonial states, although there was change, we still find that there's certain historical sequences that we continuously used to see. So one of the examples that has been used to talk about path dependency stems from the keyboard you use on your laptop. So the letters Q, W, E, R, T, and Y was a sequence that someone put into place. And this sort of now applies to how we understand colonialism within the post-colonial state. So a key example of path dependence that I used was the notion of colonialism itself. Colonialism, which saw countries like Belgium, Britain, and France obtain certain territory, and in doing so, they created particular institutions within those countries, and those institutions tended to be extractive institutions, And this also applied to my case of Zimbabwe, whereby in 1890, the British South African Company invaded the country and eventually took over the country with the aim of taking natural resources as well as farming. So my argument is that this is sort of one of the key legacies in understanding water governance. And now to link it to the laws, in Rhodesia, which I defined as the post-colonial state, there were certain laws that were passed. So for example, the Land Apportionment Act, and then as well, I think other laws such as the Maize Act as well. These had to do with the issue of land, and this also had to do with water in itself. And what's also important to understand is that for a country like Zimbabwe and also various other African countries, these countries tend to be agrarian, which places a lot of emphasis on the use of land and also the emphasis on water usage. So the laws that were passed under Rhodesia basically marginalized the African population. And again, this speaks to this inheritance that I sort of alluded to within Zimbabwe. So certain laws were passed, legislation within Rhodesia, and certain laws were drawn from, for example, in 1927, there was an act that was passed. In 1947, there was also an act that was passed, as well as in 1976. These are the three main laws that were passed under the colonial government, and these had a huge impact for the post-colonial state, and I'll come back to this later. So when discussing some of these laws, the key thinkers that I spoke to alluded to that, the fact that the water legislation was driven by agriculture, because again, I say that these countries were agrarian and water then became very, very important for the colonial government. Hence the laws that were passed that were meant to ensure that the white minority government would benefit from not only water resources, but land. And this also extended to mining as well. So I think this, again, was something I tried to link when I was discussing what I termed the colonial legacy in the country. So before proceeding to discuss post-colonial state, the idea I had with starting off with colonialism was to sort of paint a picture that sort of showed the inequalities that were as a result of colonialism. I also tried to paint a picture that sort of showed that the laws that were implemented by the colonial government were laws that were obviously meant to marginalize. But again, this speaks to our key authors, such as I think Darren Acemoglu in Why Nations Fail, who speak of the importance of institutions, Mandani as well, who speaks to the importance of institutions as well, especially within the post-colonial state. And I think this was important in terms of understanding my actual case study of Zimbabwe. So when relating this to Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe then gained independence in 1980. However, what's interesting about the independence that Zimbabwe gained in 1980 was that between 1980 and 1998, very few laws were implemented. Rather, the government kept the same laws from the colonial government. This essentially meant that there wasn't much of change in terms of the laws that the country was using. You'll find that the country was still making use of these same colonial laws, which in essence one would argue to say that colonialism was still alive, but in just a different form. And this is what we see between 1980 and 1998, because the Zimbabwean government only then implemented new water laws in 1998, but this was as a result of the integrated water resources management, which then advocated for a decentralized form of governance for water, which meant that communities were given a say, at least on paper, in how water would be governed in these particular areas. So concerning water governance in post-colonial Zimbabwe, one of the authors would argue to say that you need to look at it in two periods. The first period being the first 22 years of independence between 1980 and 1998, and then a period between 1999 and 2000. The period between 1999 and 2000 is important because this was the period then where the country then sort of tried to implement integrated water resources management. And this was done through the creation of a state-owned company that was called the Zimbabwe Water Authority, the ZINWA. And part of the mandate of ZINWA, which is state-owned, was to do with the law, policy, and legislation, and also institutional framework on water, the capacity of those who are meant to provide water for local authorities and residents as well, and then as well as stakeholder participation, which again speaks to the notion of governance in relation to water. But in terms of stakeholder participation, and this links closely to one of the chapters I wrote, which I was presenting on this morning actually, which was that of the politicization of local government in Zimbabwe. Because in the new constitution that Zimbabwe implemented in 2013, there's a clause for the decentralization of power. However, what has happened is we're seeing that there's a politicization of that mandate because the ruling party in many cases does not feel comfortable with local communities having power, because this is a scary thing for them, because these are sort of vehicles that citizens would use for uprisings and also to just air their concerns, which many ruling parties, especially within the nationalist context, do not enjoy. So this was one of the key things I sort of tried to unpack, to say, although there was a new institution in ZINWA, the Zimbabwe National Water Authority, not much was changed, because we see that the post-colonial government still had a stranglehold on power, and still had a stranglehold on water resources as well. When looking at local government, I also unpacked that there was a cholera outbreak in 2008. And one of the reasons why this cholera outbreak happened was as a result of lack of water, obviously. But if you look at it from a political perspective, what was happening was that there was a contestation of power between the ruling party in central government as well as the opposition in local government. And this contestation of power resulted in the local government not having power, hence they were not able to provide water because they lacked the resources that central government was meant to provide for them. So I thought that was also very important in understanding the dynamics in that regard as well. With the 1998 Water Act, which you just mentioned, we also then began to see the monopolization of water resources, as I've mentioned. But I think the most important element that I wanted to touch on again was this politicization, because I think this was at the heart of my entire thesis, because my main focus, again, went back to the politics of everything, because obviously my PhD was in politics, and it went back again to the power dynamics, that we saw a shift from the colonial form of rule to the post-colonial form of rule. But within that post-colonial form of rule, we sort of see the centralization of power. And this is one of the things that have hamstrung local government, which in many cases is run by the opposition. But another important point I also want to make when understanding local government within the Zimbabwean context was that the key authors who write about Zimbabwe often argue that when it comes to elections, central government is almost untouchable, in the sense that for you to win the presidency, it's virtually impossible, because this speaks to how the political party of ZANU-PF has captured all elements of the state. However, when you link it to local government, they sort of allow for a more democratic process to be seen through. This is mainly again to do with power dynamics. So essentially, these are the things that were at the heart of my paper, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards.
Okay, so we can jump to Nokutenda Ntuli, adaptation strategies against droughts on agricultural production, the case of subsistence farmers in Mphego village, Vhembe district, municipality, Limpopo.
Thank you. So I'm Nokutenda Ntuli. I'm doing my master's in development sociology. So this is an ongoing research that focuses on adaptation strategies against drought on agricultural production. I intend to do my research in Mphego village in Limpopo. So I recently submitted my proposal to the faculty, and I'm planning to do my fieldwork this coming week. So climate change has been declared as the most intricate and destructive environmental catastrophe that befalls the contemporary human civilization. Despite more than 2 decades of climate negotiations, the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change has failed to develop solutions that adequately address the severity of the climate crisis, and this is undoubtedly leading the world towards a dystopian future. In 2015, the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that carbon emissions have increased by over 400 parts per million, warming the planet closer to 2 degrees Celsius. With this shift, extreme weather events such as droughts and floods are becoming a commonplace. As climate shocks intensify and rupture the planet, their apocalyptic consequences have posed to be have led to the collapse of agricultural systems, thereby undermining the food and nutrition security of billions of people globally. Rural communities, especially financially and technologically poor small-scale farmers in developing countries, have been the most vulnerable given that agriculture is an essential component of their livelihood. As a result, climate change sheds light on how inequality is structured and reproduced in the present carbon capitalist economy. According to the World Bank reports, the African continent contributes as little as 2 to 3% of global carbon emissions from energy and industrial sources. Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa, with an estimated rural population of 60%, made up primarily of smallholder farmers, bears the largest brand of climate change compared to other world regions. Drought has been identified as one of the most costly and destructive climatic conditions affecting the livelihoods of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. The occurrence of drought has rapidly increased in the region, nearly tripling from the period of 2010 to 2019. Furthermore, it has been predicted that in the future, drought events will exacerbate in water-stressed African countries. While agriculture is a key economic and social sector for most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, contributing about 23% of the region's GDP, the frequency and intensity of drought in the region has triggered a massive crop yield deficit, the most vulnerable being small-scale rain-fed agriculture, with an approximated 50% decline in agricultural output in 2020. Consequently, drought has intensified the food crisis in sub-Saharan African countries who are already at the grip of poverty owing to deteriorated economies. This is the reality in rural areas where the bulk of the population are poor small-scale farmers who are heavily reliant on rain-fed agriculture as the primary source of food security. In South Africa, drought is a recurring phenomenon that occurs at varying degrees. The 2015 drought was quantified by the South African government as the worst drought the country ever experienced in 23 years due to its horrendous impact on both small-scale and commercial agricultural sectors, as well as on vulnerable populations. Drought events in South Africa have worsened the food insecurity and poverty in most rural communities. Highly degraded, rain-fed agriculture-dependent rural communities in the semi-arid region of Limpopo province have been identified as high poverty and food insecure nodes. Unlike commercial farmers who have easy access to financial, human, and social capital, as well as information to hedge against climate risk, the vulnerability of rural-based small-scale farmers to drought episodes has been aggravated by the lack of institutional support, and this is unquestionably the case in Limpopo province. The South African government has failed to improve preparedness to cope with drought conditions in rural communities due to the insufficient provision of a water infrastructure and agricultural extension services. Given the failure of the conventional top-down approaches in reducing the vulnerability of rural small-scale farmers in South Africa to drought, it is imperative to explore how these marginalized farmers have autonomously developed adaptation strategies to build resilient food systems in the face of drought in their geographical area in order to secure the household food and nutrition security. Climate change adaptation is a necessity in developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where impoverished rural populations are already experiencing the detrimental effects of climate change, given that their livelihoods are dependent on climate-sensitive activities. While actions to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases are critical in evading the deadly consequences of climate change, adaptation measures are equally important in responding to the climate crisis. Climate mitigation measures that have been implemented by the international community may not be able to counteract the long-term impact of global warming in the future. Based on this rationale, policymakers and scientists have prioritized adaptation as an essential complement to mitigation in the development agenda. According to current predictions, the African continent will experience the severe effects of climate change, and local communities need to swiftly adapt in order to cope with these effects. In this slide, the adaptation paradigm serves as a new prophecy for developing nations, powerfully instilling in them the idea that adaptation to climate change is a fundamental requirement for survival. So this study adopts the IPCC definition of adaptation, which is the adjustments in human and natural systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or effects that moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. According to FAO, the agriculture-dependent communities have a long history of developing ways to cope with climate change in their operational environment, which is reflective of an autonomous adaptation. Today's rate of climate change will alter recognized variability patterns to the point that humans will face challenges they are ill prepared to meet. As a result, autonomous adaptation strategies have their limitations, which makes it vital to increasingly implement anticipatory and planned adaptation strategies. However, FAO acknowledges that vulnerabilities to climate change are predominantly local. Thus, it's imperative for communities to autonomously develop adaptation strategies that respond to the heterogeneous local impacts of climate change. This approach to climate change is based on the premise that local solutions are required to local problems, which is relevant for my study because I seek to investigate localized adaptation strategies that are autonomously developed by subsistence farmers to mitigate the impacts of drought on agricultural production. Previous studies conducted in sub-Saharan Africa suggest that small-scale farmers have over the centuries developed a suite of adaptation strategies to keep agricultural production afloat in dire climatic conditions. The adaptive capacity of farmers is highly influenced by a variety of socio-economic livelihood assets at their disposal, namely natural, social, financial, physical, and human capital. As a result, context-specific climate adaptation strategies may not be the same in a different setting. This study seeks to explore the existing context-specific adaptation strategies employed by rain-fed agriculture-dependent subsistence farmers in Mphego village to mitigate the impact of drought on agricultural production. The theoretical underpinning of this study is the sustainable livelihood framework. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks and maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets both now and in the future without depleting the natural resource base. The Sustainable Livelihood Framework has a focus on people's adaptive capacity or survival skills in their different environmental contexts, characterized by factors such as trends, shocks, and seasonality. The Sustainable Livelihood Framework is significantly useful for my study because it can be used to investigate the socio-economic livelihood assets that influence the adaptive capacity of rural subsistence farmers in response to natural shocks such as droughts. Given that the impacts and vulnerability to drought vary in different geographical areas, these studies were doing because there's a huge possibility that the drought adaptation strategies used by subsistence farmers in Mphego village in Limpopo would offer a distinctively new narrative and contribute to the current literature in Limpopo on this topic. Thank you.
So through you, Chad, I don't think Nokutenda is going to join us. We've got that message. He's not featuring there. And I don't think Charles will join us as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so keep that because we're going to open the floor to questions. So if anyone online has questions that they want to send through to the chat, and if anyone here has questions, go ahead. Okay, if there's nothing else, then Prof, go ahead.
So thank you to the panel. That was amazing and also very stimulating.
just okay. So Baba, you know, you kind of drawing on his sort of a geographic historical materialism, and you're looking at Lefebvre and Harvey, and I think you mentioned someone else. Can you say more about that theoretical approach to spatiality? Gwinyai, I mean, so path dependence suggests that, you know, there's almost a teleological outcome. There's an inevitability coming out of history. But as you mentioned, you know, Zinwa was created. There was no gun to the Zimbabwean government's head, to the ZANU PF. They could have done way more to break path dependency and inaugurate a whole new water regime, like. I'd like you to kind of engage with that idea. What were the paths not taken, or, you know, what else could have been done to break the path dependency? And then Nokutenda, there's two issues here, and, you know, I'm going to try and ask these questions so that you can answer them based on your proposal. So this concept of adaptation, I've been wrestling with this a long time, and I'm, you know, most climate discourse walks on these two legs, mitigation and adaptation. But as we've started to live climate extremes, I'm coming to a conclusion that this sort of conceptual approach to the climate challenge is inadequate. That actually, you know, when some of these shocks hit, they literally bring down socio-ecological systems. Farming systems collapse. Our food system collapsed during the drought, commercial system. Our crops failed, our livestock had to be slaughtered, etc., etc. If you look at flooding, I mean, what happened in KZN? I mean, the flooding even destroyed existing water infrastructure, etc. So you have socio-ecological systems collapsing when these shocks register, and there's something else that has to happen in that moment. That's not adaptation. That's what I call transformative regeneration. And there, you got to build back the systems, but not in the same way. Transformative regeneration means you're building new socio-ecological. I just want to throw that at you because I just think the definition of adaptation is maybe too broad. It's too elastic. It's just not capturing what we're living with climate extremes. So I want to pose that challenge to you. So as you do your project, you think about this. So those farmers in that district in Limpopo, in the midst of the drought, I'm sure at some point without water, they were hit hard and they had to build back. Okay, but it's something you'd work out. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then the other issue is around agroecology as a science. And I'm not are you going to be probing that? You know, so the actual farming practices that give resilience, and maybe you want to say more about that. Thanks.
Again, it's just from my hands-on kind of field work that I'm doing. Nokutenda, when I was chatting to farmers down in Ponderland, for instance, they're seeing quite big shifts. So they were seeing shifts in terms of bacterial infestation of livestock, where previously they were able to deal with these issues with traditional medicines and traditional means. Suddenly they were having to bring in, you know, large-scale antibiotics and keep medicines always on the shelf for livestock. And this is new for them. So traditional ways and traditional adaptive ways they were finding they weren't functioning because of seasonal shift as well. So where they would expect certain events to happen, and they would prep for them, suddenly those events were happening much earlier or much later. Are you doing any field work in regard to this, where you're actually sitting talking to farmers about, you know, what's happened in the last 10 years? How do you envisage going forward with this kind of level of unpredictability? Because, yeah, I mean, Francois Engelbrecht has said that if we have to go through another 3.5 year drought, our agriculture might be on its knees, you know. And are you connecting with any of the work that he's doing in broaching agriculture in the country? He's working with the beef and the maize industry, I believe. I don't know if you're aware of that. Okay, so Prof. Francois Engelbrecht, he's a climate scientist right here. Francois Engelbrecht, and he is a god. He's worked with the IPCC, so his climate science features in the IPCC, and his focus has been on the beef and maize industries and trying to prepare them for what's coming. So it might be a good idea to engage with him, and he's got all sorts of predictive their data and what they punch out in their offices there is incredible. So that'll feed right into your research. Be very exciting. Yeah, and it's important research you're doing. Really, really important.
Any other questions from anyone? I don't know if we want to go to Babatunde first, since he's online, and then we can go to you guys if he wants to respond. Just give us a minute to switch the mic over.
Can I go ahead? All right. So thank you, Prof, for the question. You were referring to theoretical implications for these mapping exercise. Like I stated earlier in the presentation, the framework, the conceptual approach for the paper was looking at the work of Ave, Dorin Massey, and Lefebvre. From the perspective of Lefebvre, whose argument was that space is social product, I think that this mapping exercise emphasizes his argument about space as a means for social action. So the maps try to conceptualize space from the perspective of subaltern, and it also ensures the delineation of the people's view about development. Besides that, I think it also draws the importance of space in how we conceive alternative futures. Going to Ave's argument concerning the role of space or capitalist rationality in the production of postcolonial space, I think that these mapping exercises draw an important lesson to the issue of shifts in the cycle of unfulfilled promises, particularly the challenge of the valorization and devaluation of capitalist development colonial states. It draws attention to people's solutions, like one of the earlier speakers too. And I also think that, like Ave engaged in his text, the history of neoliberalism, he talked about the usual social movements. And I think that these community-based organizations, the idea is about rethinking the settlement scheme, tries to uplift silent voices, where you have an history of alternative thinking, but like I said, there is a lack of tangibility. So the visual representation draws attention to these silent voices. Again, I was looking at the issue of Dorin Massey, and Dorin Massey's argument was that space should be considered as social relations stretched out. And if we look at this, the kind of empirical data I gathered, I could see that there's a lot of connections between the people and the ideas that were passed, not necessarily because of nostalgic reasons, but they could understand that the sustenance of society is firmly rooted in the land. And so there is this conceptualization or rethinking of available previous ideas to answer the fundamental challenge today, that is the state crisis, the inability of the state to take development forward. And so one of the adaptation strategies, though you refer to it as being a broad concept, but I want to believe that within Laveb's argument of a space of social action, these mapping exercises draw attention to how these alternative futures can be given a new look so that we can move forward by driving this agenda within the subzone so that it moves from the realm of dependence on governments, like Gwinyai spoke about, the issue of recycling colonial ideas. And I think that will be my answer for now. Thank you.
So concerning Zinwa, so within the Zimbabwean case, you find that in terms of policies, they implement one of the best policies, at least on paper. So in order for us to understand Zinwa and its creation, we need to probably take a step back to the negotiated settlement in terms of Zimbabwe's independence. And one of the key issues with the nationalist movement in Zimbabwe was the land question. And because of the negotiated settlement with the British government, that took a bit longer for them. They had to wait 10 years for them to actually implement land reform. So you find that between 1980 until about 1997, 1998, the land question was in the background, but nothing was done in terms of addressing it. So you find that with the creation of the opposition, ZANU-PF as the government was then forced to actually start implementing this type of policies. And for me, I think this was one of the reasons that then led to the creation of Zinwa, which on paper was actually a very good initiative because of the things it says on paper. So for example, giving power to local communities, and actually paying, like if as a citizen, if you pay for water, you get the service. But again, it goes back to what I then argued is the power dynamics within the country to then say, if Zinwa is really working as a private institution, as they said, there was a lot of government influence in it, and this is still the case today. But it also then goes back to the challenge of local government, which then again is this contestation we see between central government as well as local government. And this is one of the reasons why we find that although on paper there's this policy that Zinwa has created through the Water Act, which gives, for example, power to local communities, not much has been done in terms of implementation. But however, on paper, I think it is one of the more progressive policies that they have actually introduced since the attainment of independence. However, with the power dynamics, it's a bit difficult to actually implement it because of these dynamics because ZANU-PF doesn't want to lose power. But my hope or our hope was that with the new president, this was something that was going to be addressed. And there have been efforts to do that through, for example, providing funds for actual devolution, which is the decentralization of power. And the idea is that this will help with water governance. This will also help with communities as well. And also the notion of path dependence, again, I think is something that we're continuously seeing replicated, especially through these particular laws. And I think this is areas that we also still need to explore. But on paper, I would argue to say that the policy was actually very brilliant in that it actually acknowledged communities that had been marginalized for a long time. And I think with the new president who's in place now, well, I can't call him new, but it's a move from Mugabe. I think we are moving towards a period where we'll see the country actually begin to implement these laws. And I'm a bit hopeful that we'll see that the Water Act will actually be in place and there will be an improvement in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you for the constructive criticism, Prof. Janet. And you also raised some important points with regards to traditional farming practices. So the initial, before, like I changed my research, by the way, like before the faculty presentation, I intended to focus solely on traditional indigenous farming practices. But following the comments, I kind of changed it a bit because they say that in the issue of indigeneity is controversial because it no longer exists in its 100% like form. So I kind of broadened it up a bit instead of solely focusing on indigenous strategies. So now I'm just looking at any strategy that they're using, like that they have developed by themselves. So if indigenous knowledge pops up, then yeah, I'll also include it in my findings.
Okay, do we have any other more comments, questions? Anyone online that wants to raise a point? So then
Baba, your study, if I understood it correctly, you had these two kinds of settlement schemes, the state one, and then you had this indigenous one in West Africa. And do you have some insights into how the indigenous one kind of played out? I mean, did it, was it given space, and was it more successful? And I don't know how you measure success in all of this, but it'll be nice to hear more about that as a decolonial future, as compared to the state-centric top-down settlement scheme. And then Gwinyai, I mean, I'm so you did this as a historian or a political scientist? Political scientist, right? So I think one of the things we have to do in a big way in the context of the climate crisis is rethink the state. And we have to really think about, what are the competencies, what are the functions for a state that's not serving global capitalism. As far as I'm concerned, that's over. A state that's going to help us survive. And so I just like to ask, based on your research, what can we learn for the remaking of the state, for addressing the climate emergency, the crisis, and the deep just transition? I mean, how should the state, I mean, this maybe I was asking you to even step back from your own case study. I mean, how should the state ideally manage water regimes in the context of climate-driven world? And then Nokutenda, I mean, yes, you are looking at autonomous sort of bottom-up sort of strategies and so on. And maybe, using the term indigenous knowledge may not be maybe appropriate. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, I mean, I think the issue for me is, are you going to be looking at, because that area, that district is quite vast, and John Nzira, right? Have you heard of John Nzira? Okay, so they've been working with a hub model in rural Limpopo, a food sovereignty hub model, where there's a kind of conglomeration of households, and they support each other, and then they have a kind of backbone support institution, which gives them a whole lot of resourcing, etc., seeds and training and things like that. I mean, we've actually invented our own hub model here at WITS. Okay, so I'm just intrigued from preparing your proposal, and maybe your fieldwork will verify this. And maybe you should tell us more why you chose this particular case, because is there something salient? Is there something striking about the agricultural practice from afar, even? So. maybe before you do that, because we have some time, I'm going to just pose a question to everyone in the room. I'm hoping to get out of our engagements here today and tomorrow a kind of a disruption of the knowledge project in the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, I started off by talking about, we need a new humanism because, what we're teaching students in the humanities, including the social sciences, in my view, at Wits, is not equipping them. It's anthropocentric, and we need an eco-human humanism. Now, using that as a starting point, given that you all are in different disciplines, I mean, how can we disrupt these disciplines so that they take the climate and the larger ecological crisis seriously? I mean, for me, this knowledge project is about giving a spur to that. Okay, I mean, ideally, and I was having this discussion with Mucha, we shouldn't have the faculty of humanities anymore. It should be the faculty of eco-humanity. Okay, so this is a provocation, which means then all disciplines that fall within its remit should be remade, right, to take on board natural relations, ecological relations, etc. I'm just throwing this out there. How do we remake the knowledge project? I mean, some of you are finding your way in your discipline and your projects, etc. But I think it's an important question, and I'd like to hear your voices about it. It's not just us as academics that have to think all of this. You also have to make your own contribution. Thanks.
Hi, can I go on?
So in terms of rethinking the state, so when I first started my research, I had certain biases towards the Zimbabwean government for obvious reasons. But through the whole fieldwork process, I sort of had new revelations about certain things, and this has prompted me to actually one of the papers I'm working on at the moment is sort of understanding the transition of a nationalist movement into becoming a political party, because obviously stemming from my research. And you find that in terms of rethinking the state, I looked back at, for example, how nationalist movements would operate. And one of the things that was central to their operation was the community. So essentially socialism. And I'm not a socialist, by the way, but I believe that the whole concept they had in terms of fighting colonialism, of working with communities through guerrilla warfare, was a very good initiative, because it showed what could happen if communities from a lower level could work together. And this is something I think the gentleman who actually marked my thesis spoke about, how his research focused on how local communities were able to have their own farming processes. So I think I spoke about this in one of our previous sessions, whereby if farming is extremely important in the neighborhood, so to say, if, for example, I'm having problems and I need help with harvesting, for example, we call the whole community, they come to my house and we harvest. And that's how it works, without the help of the government. So in terms of rethinking the state, I think one of the things that needs to happen is there has to be an implementation of the decentralization of power, whereby there's an actual inclusion of the community. And by inclusion, I don't mean in terms of it being on paper, but it being practical through the use of traditional leaders and so forth. Unfortunately, what is happening within some of our African countries is that there is this politicization whereby the rule of vote, for example, is important. But if there can be a shift in terms of the state actually engaging communities from a lower level, I think that is one of the vehicles that could actually be used. Because if you look at the end of apartheid, if you look at the end of colonialism, be it in Kenya or Zimbabwe, there was an initiative that was from the local communities. Look at the uprisings in Soweto, for example. Those are all just local communities. So I think the challenge or the fear that these governments have is that if they engage the local communities, they could be losing power, which is not the case in many instances. So I think that engagement, I think, is something that we can look at in terms of water regimes, because I think you just touched on indigenous knowledge. And I think that is one of the most important elements, because I didn't use it for my thesis. However, some of the local communities, especially in rural areas, had been recording rainfall for a very, very long time and keeping this on record. And you can sort of see the differing patterns in rainfall, for example. But the government doesn't think about stuff like that because they don't really engage the community. So I think there is more that needs to be done in terms of indigenous knowledge. I think Charles was working on something along those lines, and I think Tatenda is also working on something along those lines. So the use of indigenous knowledge, because local communities have knowledge of what they want, and that is something that needs to be bridged in terms of governance from the central to the local. And I think, I don't know if that answers your question. I can also go on all day as well. Okay, thank you.
So what inspired me to do this topic is the fact that climate change is intensifying, right? And the government is not doing much to help rural communities. So I just want to understand how, like, they're managing to secure their food security in these dire climatic conditions, even without the support of the government, like how they're adapting. But I also look at what you proposed, the idea of transformative regeneration. So I think that's what motivated me to do it.
So two things that are coming through that I've found in my own studies. One with fishers, so small scale fishers who are fighting offshore oil and gas. When you start talking to them about the threat of offshore oil and gas, what's coming out is this complete threat to a way of life. And the way of life was, I suppose, what we generally would, in sweeping terms, would be called a sort of a form of Ubuntu. So where you had your snook fishers, and there's strong traditional koi and sand communities among the West Coast fishers. If they had a good harvest, everyone ate. But if the harvest was poor, then it's a case of dividing amongst the community. And that was how those communities lived. And it was a sharing, the old style farming community. It was sharing to make sure that the whole community survived and everyone benefited, because, there's good harvests and there's bad harvests. And then the second one, and they're saying that is completely under threat at the moment. So there's job insecurity that government is leveraging in the space. So the youth are feeling insecure, and there isn't the supportive role anymore because of industrialized fishing influx, plus also oil and gas coming in and wanting to develop in their communities. And then secondly, and I can't remember the name of the fellow, water. So early predictive water. One of the early climate scientists who did incredible stuff in the 50s in Germany, and I think he was, I can't remember if it was, I think he was German, and he used to go off to Siberia to monitor water and weather in those areas. And he had this incredible following on radio, because the farmers wanted to know what he had to say, because he was always right about his weather predictions. But he was constantly deferring to local knowledge in the areas, and he would amass data from local knowledge, and he would make predictions based on that. And he was seen as this kind of oddball scientist, but all of it was based in real field data. But he's deemed as one of the sort of early predictive climate scientists, and people are now wishing that some of his archives had been better stored, because he kind of fell into this kind of cloud of a bit of a zany fellow. But they're digging up his archives now, and they're finding that he was spot on. So I think these are this look backwards is going to be so very important for us to look beyond sort of sexy techno science back to old data and old means, because boy, I think it's going to be the only thing that's going to carry us forward.
But the point is that these institutions are meant to equip us to be part of the world out there. Okay.
Yeah.
And are they equipping us? I think this is what I'm getting at. In a world that's facing dramatic transformations. If you're talking about temporalities, time, I mean, the more we heat, the more intense it's going to get. Okay, and it's going to arrive at us in catastrophic ways
And fast. It's
and
happening
fast.
very, very
Yeah.
fast.
So this is what I'm trying to get at. It's like you can't be. I mean, I can't sit in a classroom in 10 years' time and kind of maybe teach mainstream international relations when the world is just falling apart.
Well, you might not be able to make it work.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just understanding what climate science is giving us. I mean, it doesn't have everything figured out about the future. It gives us these broad trends and so on. But what does that mean for universities? What does that mean for disciplines? What does that mean for bodies of knowledge? This is what I'm grappling.
Let's look at what, I mean, when I take on that question, I go, okay, I'm making a film. A film is, yeah, it's a transfer of meaning and it's an expression, but it's also, hopefully, if it's got any of that use value I'm talking about, it's also a transfer of some knowledge. I'm hopefully putting out a question or two that you can use for yourself. So how does one disrupt that normal way of putting that question out there? How does that question then become useful?
Mm-hmm.
How does one invigorate it so that it's not full of despair, but it becomes agential, it becomes something that you say, this is something you can work with, this works. Because so much is, at the moment, it doesn't work. You have this conversation about renewables and people tell you, oh, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, it doesn't work. So what works?
Okay, so let me ask it slightly differently, right? So if you look at the university and its disciplines, people have built careers on this. They've invested time, part of their lives. They've raised grants, they've raised funds, they've built a knowledge project, etc., around these disciplines. Okay. So when you stand up and say, you know what, we're now living on a new planet and everything is changed and is going to change, do they continue kind of doing what they're doing? So thinking about economics the way they've been thinking about economics, okay? Or do they rise to this challenge, right? Climate emergency economics. This is not an easy thing to broach. I think this is what I'm trying to get at, and this is why I'm trying to push you all to think with me. It's you have an institution that's path dependent, that's going in a particular direction. It's locked. Okay. How do you change that? How do you get the academic project to be more relevant? I think that's what I'm getting at. Now, there's another issue there at the heart of all of this, is what is knowledge production at the university? So one of the concepts at the heart of the traditional university is, well, this is a place for freedom to think, and we do whatever we want, and that's the liberal conception of the university, and it's knowledge for knowledge's sake. Okay. I'm asking, well, given that we're facing extinction, does that knowledge, that version of intellectual production continue, knowledge for knowledge's sake, so you do whatever esoteric thing you want? Or do we kind of rethink the knowledge project around how we survive? Now, I'll be called a fascist by liberals if I raise this question more sharply, but this is what is at stake. Okay? This debate is not really happening. It's happening right now in the Zoom. Okay? This university is behind the curve like most institutions in this country on this question. So we've got to grapple with this issue. Okay? And I think it's not just me, it's like the students raising decolonizing. What are you going to say about changing the university in the context of climate crisis? There's a lot here. There's a lot at stake here. I don't want to become an evangelist for university that is remade in the context of the climate crisis and how we survive. But I do want to provoke the debates. I want to get my colleagues to think. I want them to really wake up, you know. That's where I'm.